Hey everyone, it's Alex, and a couple days ago I posted my video of my top 15 worst films of 2018. Now it's time for my top 15 best films of 2018. And like my worst films list, my best list is my own list. It's very subjective. Your list may be very similar, maybe it's very different, but these are my best films of 2018 based on my movie-going experiences of the past year. Now, if a film on your list is not on my list, it's probably because I either never saw that film, because while I saw a lot of movies, I didn't get to see every single one of them due to time and money, like most of you as well, I assume. Or maybe I did see that movie but didn't find it nearly good enough to put on my list. But like my worst list, I have a lot of honorable mentions before I get to my top 15. So let's get through those first. My honorable mentions are Beirut, Annihilation, Pope Francis, A Man of His Word, Green Book, The Wife, Chappaquiddick, Lean on Pete, Whitney, Mary Poppins Returns, Boy Erased, Searching, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, Suspiria, Sorry to Bother You, Isle of Dogs, Hereditary, A Private War, Bad Times at the El Royale, Widows, First Reformed, Ready Player One, Hearts Beat Loud, and Incredibles 2. Now, let's begin the countdown. Number 15, Leave No Trace. I'll admit, when I first saw the trailer of this film, I was intrigued, but I was worried it was going to be a ripoff of a film I had on my Best Films of 2016 video, Captain Fantastic. And while there is some similarity of the fact that both films feature families living in the wilderness and then being forced to live in civilization, beyond that the stories are very different. Leave No Trace is a very powerful film about this father and daughter played by Ben Foster and Thomasin McKenzie. Ben Foster's character is an Iraq war veteran who suffers from PTSD, and while we don't really get the full details about why he's chosen to live in the wilderness with his daughter, it's very clear that he cannot and does not want to function in normal civilization. And the daughter has pretty much grown up this way her entire life, so she really doesn't know anything about living normally. And then when they're kind of forced back into civilization, we see them struggling to adapt to that way of life, and then we see them kind of being lured back out there into the wilderness again. Now, the great thing about this film is not only does it have amazing performances by Ben Foster and Thomasin McKenzie, but it has amazing writing and directing from Deborah Granick, who also directed Winter's Bone. This film also makes you ask yourself a lot of tough questions, and it made me ask myself, if I were in that situation, would I do the exact same thing? And my honest answer is, I don't know. There were some things that some characters did that I was strongly opposed to, but then I had to acknowledge that those characters did those things because their experiences in life kind of led them down that path. And I had to acknowledge to myself that I have not gone on the same kind of journey these characters have, and because of that, I know I wouldn't be able to make that same kind of decision just based on what I've gone through. But if I had, I honestly don't know. And the film never necessarily makes a strong position one way or another towards a character's actions. It really lets you decide for yourself. Some people might want a more obvious statement on some things, but this is one of those movies, I think, that if you do see it, you'll really think to yourself about what you would do in that situation. I know what I would do, but based on what I think should be done, but then I've never actually experienced what these characters have, and once you actually experience something, you don't really know what you'll do until you're actually having to confront a certain problem. Now, this is not one of those deeply metaphorical movies that make you think, what is this even all about, like, say, 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's very direct and precise about what it's showcasing, but it's one of those films that'll definitely leave you thinking about a lot of stuff after the credits start rolling. Number 14, The Rider. If you were disappointed by Clint Eastwood's film The 1517 to Paris and the fact that three non-actors playing the lead roles gave terrible performances, you might be asking yourself, can a good movie be made with non-actors playing the lead roles? And in this case, the answer is yes. Yes, it can. With the right direction and the right script and the right story, a non-actor who's never acted but has the lead role can do just fine. And The Rider is the perfect example of that. The Rider tells the story of this guy named Brady Jandreau. That's his real name, and in the movie his first name is Brady, but he uses a different last name. And like in the movie, Brady Jandreau in real life was a rodeo rider until a horrific injury forced him to stop. And in the movie we see him going through the same thing, and his injury was so bad, doctors told him, you have to stop riding, because if you don't, you'll die. And we see him literally having his life pretty much taken away from him, because that's all he's done his whole life, and he literally doesn't know what he's going to do with the rest of his life now that he can't do that anymore. And he's kind of has to be the man of his family, because his father's an alcoholic and his sister is severely autistic and obviously can't take care of herself. So we see him trying to find other jobs, as well as trying to find a way to stay in the rodeo world without having to go that far, because he also had a friend who suffered the same kind of injury but now lives in a nursing home and needs 24-hour care. So the real-life experiences of Brady Jandreau combined with Chloe Zhao's magnificent directing really bring you into this world and really make you feel for this guy as he's going through basically a quarter-life crisis. He's like in his early 20s, but now he literally has no idea what he wants to do with the rest of his life. And while it's very obvious that Brady Jandreau, as well as his real-life father and sister, who play his father and sister in this movie, have had no acting experience and they're probably never going to be professional actors, it's obvious that they're not professional actors, but still the way they portray things under Chloe Zhao's direction really makes you feel empathetic for them and really kept me engaged as I watched it. And it's a slow burn movie, and some of you might be turned off by that, but it's one of those movies that's really flown under the radar, and it has picked up some love from critics groups and such, but I haven't really heard too many people putting this on their best list. And that's a shame, because this really is a movie I think people should check out, especially if you're the kind of person that wants to see a movie do something a little different that most other movies don't do. Number 13, The Favorite. I'll admit, I've liked Yorgos Lanthimos' past movies, but haven't necessarily loved them. Both The Lobster and The Killing of a Sacred Deer had great performances and interesting premises, but never really executed them to their full potential. I can't really go into detail about why, because that would involve spoilers, and that itself would be its own video, but I'm going to say that thankfully The Favorite massively improved upon both those films and is easily his best film to date. Plus, it's a historical film, and since I studied history in college, I had to see it anyway, no matter who was directing it or who was starring in it. But this film basically tells the story of Queen Anne of England in the early 1700s, and she has this lady-in-waiting played by Rachel Weisz, and then Rachel Weisz's cousin, played by Emma Stone, comes to the palace because she's fallen on hard times, and then she gains Queen Anne's favor, and then the two of them compete to be her favorite, as the title implies. So this has been nominated as a comedy at like the Golden Globes, and I can kind of see why, because it is very much a dark comedy in many ways. There's many dramatic moments, there's a lot of witty dialogue and banter that make it comedic, even if it's not like the traditional ha-ha-ha type of comedy like, say, you would see from someone like Will Ferrell or Seth Rogen. But, you know, comedy aside, this film is magnificent across the board. The acting is incredible. Olivia Colman, Rachel Weisz, and Emma Stone are all getting Oscar buzz, and rightfully so. All three of them are magnificent in this movie. The rest of the cast, including Nicholas Hoult and Joe Alwyn and several others, they're amazing too. The production and design and costumes, my God, they are beautiful. If they do not win the Oscars for production design and costume design, I will be very upset, because This is just absolutely beautiful and breathtaking, and you can tell just how much effort they put into recreating this time period. And also the cinematography. Cinematography is gorgeous. I think it looks like they used a lot of natural lighting for this, because the scenes never feel like they're brightly lit. You know, a lot of artificial lighting is used in cinematography for obvious reasons, but a lot of times in some period films, the cinematographer and the director will decide to use no artificial lights and use only sunlight or candlelight if scenes are taking place at night. Stanley Kubrick famously did that with his movie Barry Lyndon, and so did Alejandro González Iñárritu with The Revenant. And it looks like they do it here, because all the way these scenes are shot, especially at night, it really feels like you've been transported back in time to the 1700s. The screenplay for this film by Deborah Davis and Tony McNamara, very witty and lots of dialogue, but never feels overbearing, and Yorgos Lanthimos' direction, amazing. He better get a Best Director Oscar nomination for this. It's a shame he was snubbed at the Golden Globes. So if you love historical films, you need to check this out. If you love any of the actors involved, you need to check it out. If you like films that tell an interesting story, such as what this tells, and it is based on a true story, I'm sure some liberties were probably taken here and there, because admittedly I don't know much about this period of British history, but it's a very fascinating story nonetheless, and even if you don't love the movie as much as I have, I think you'll at least respect the artistry that is clearly on display here. Number 12, Can You Ever Forgive Me? Boy, oh boy, Melissa McCarthy really needed a good movie after have two back-to-back flops with both Life of the Party and The Happy Time Murders. And my God, did she deliver here. This is easily her greatest performance I have ever seen from her. There's a lot of talk about her getting an Oscar nomination for this, and it's very well deserved. And this is also based on a true story. It tells the story of Lee Israel, who at one point was a successful celebrity biographer who wrote books about people like Katharine Hepburn and Tallulah Bankhead. But by the early 1990s, which is when this movie takes place, she's fallen on hard times. She can't pay her rent, she has a sick cat and can't pay the vet bills, and no one wants to hire her because she's a very unpleasant person. So she resorts to forging letters from literary icons, first just to pay her bills, but then when she starts getting this rush from it and becomes addicted and recruits her friend Jack, played by Richard E. Grant, to help her. And what's interesting about this movie is that it makes you empathize with two characters who are both very unpleasant people. Lee Israel is very unpleasant. She has a very negative attitude. She's an alcoholic. She's very rude and belligerent. And her friend Jack is also an alcoholic, and he's very promiscuous. He brags a lot about men he slept with. The main focus of this movie is that it makes you not necessarily root for these people and the bad things they do, but rather understand why they do them. I know for a fact myself that I would never forge letters or drink heavily or things like that, but the movie makes it clear exactly why they do it. And as a result, they have this great chemistry with each other, and almost kind of like a Bonnie and Clyde type of relationship, but without the romance. The direction by Mariel Heller is great. The screenplay by Nicole Holofcener, if that's how you say her name, and Jeff Whitty is great. And the overall early 90s look and feel to this movie is captured really well. This is another fascinating true life story that you may have never heard about, but it's definitely worth checking out. If you've been fearing that Melissa McCarthy wouldn't be able to give a good performance again based off her recent string of bad films, this proves that she still does have talent. Just please, for the love of God, do not put her with her husband Ben Falcone in a movie again. They already have another movie coming out later this year around Christmas, but after that, no more. Melissa McCarthy, just stick to these good scripts and good directors. Number 11, On Chesil Beach. This is a movie that, well, it's gotten generally positive reception from critics. wasn't necessarily the most acclaimed films of last year, and it's also a film that, even though it came out mainly in limited release, still really flew under the radar. And that's a shame, because I really love this movie. It's based on a novel by Ian McEwan. He's the same guy who wrote the novel Atonement, which of course became a massive critical and awards success back in 2007. And he also, Ian McEwan in this case, actually wrote the screenplay for this movie as well. And this book that this movie is based on is only about 200 pages long. But man, does it hit you in the gut in those 200 pages, especially towards the end. And same with this movie too. This movie follows a couple named Florence and Edward, played by Saoirse Ronan and Billy Howell, as they go on their honeymoon at this hotel on a beach. And it's at this hotel that they really have to discuss their marriage, because they kind of went into their marriage in love, but not necessarily knowing how they want to live their lives as a married couple. Like, they didn't discuss things about wanting to have children or any of the other things that you would discuss in premarital counseling, because they didn't go through that. And the whole point of the movie is to showcase how their very opposite backgrounds and family history kind of set them up for massive conflicts in their marriage, because both of them have very strong ideas about what their marriage should be like, and neither of them wants to make changes about it. So this movie, in addition to the magnificent performances from the cast, as well as the great script, great direction, and some absolutely beautiful cinematography. Seriously, the cinematography, especially on the beach, is just absolutely glorious. And, you know, I'm personally a big sucker for cinematography that focuses a lot on things like beaches and water and bright colors and things like that, although I do love dark colors too when they're showcased effectively, such as Saving Private Ryan with its gloomy color palette, but of course that serves the movie very well. But here, like, you know, everything looks very bright, but it's also part of the message where brightness does not necessarily mean things will turn out right in the end. And this movie is a very sobering warning about marriage for true love versus marriage for the sake of love. And this movie kind of depicts the latter. It basically showcases why couples who want to be married and hope to be married until one of them dies really need to know exactly how each other thinks and feels completely about everything before actually getting married. You know, and that includes like the very uncomfortable things that people don't want to talk about. Again, I can't say too much because this is one of those movies that you should really see for yourself without too much knowledge beyond, say, what the trailer shows you. But it's one of those movies that will definitely make you think about how you interact with people in your life romantically. And it's a very sobering reminder of that fact. Number 10, RBG. This, of course, is the documentary about Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it more or less follows the basic documentary biopic format about a person's life. It goes through Ruth Bader Ginsburg's childhood, her college years, her marriage to her husband, raising her children, going and rising up through the ranks from law professor to judge, and finally to getting on the Supreme Court. I knew the basic facts about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life, but there were a lot of things I never knew about her. Like, I never knew how supportive her husband was of her in terms of believing in equality for women, because most men back then believed themselves to be better than their wives, but he didn't. He saw himself as his wife's equal, not her superior. And I didn't know that she famously took on a sex discrimination case in which a man was discriminated against, even though, of course, she fought for many women who were being discriminated against on their gender. We see interviews not just from her, but her kids, President Bill Clinton, because he appointed her to the Supreme Court. This documentary, although it doesn't necessarily break any new grounds with its storytelling, it still is a very compelling and fascinating portrayal of a woman who most people know either from seeing her on television or just seeing her photo on news sites and whatever. But it really shows that the more we learn about someone, the more we can gain a greater appreciation of them. And I definitely gained a much greater appreciation of Ruth Bader Ginsburg from watching this documentary. And, you know, she is one of the toughest people I think I've ever seen a documentary about, because, you know, she's in her 80s and she's gone through many health issues in recent years. She's had several bouts of cancer, and like recently she was in the hospital for broken ribs, I believe. She's gone through a lot of things that most people think should make her want to retire by now, but she's said, nope, I'm never retiring. I'm going to work on this chord until I literally cannot work on it anymore. And bravo to her, because I like people who love their life and their job so much that they just want to keep doing it, because it's what makes them get up in the morning and what makes them want to go through the day. Because I think people need to have some kind of passion or determination in their life to make them enjoy it, because it's these kind of people who often contribute a lot to the world, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg has definitely contributed a lot, and this documentary is a perfect showcase of why. Number 9, 8th grade. Now, I'll admit I am not as aware of Bo Burnham's work as other people are. I've never really watched his stand-up comedy specials or YouTube videos. So I didn't know what to expect of this movie. However, I was very hopeful given the rave reviews it received at the Sundance Film Festival. And even though this is his directorial debut, my God, it feels like Bo Burnham is a true professional, because this film was incredible. It made me think a lot about my own time in 8th grade, and it also made me think about how much has changed since I was in 8th grade, because I was in 8th grade in the mid-2000s, and there were a lot of things that I remember, like obsession with the internet. Some kids, although not all of them, had cell phones. There were not like stereotypical cliques at my school like you would see in a movie, but there were definitely groups of people who like always were friends together and always hung out with each other in certain groups and things like that. But of course a lot of things has changed. You know, kids nowadays have like, all of them have cell phones, like the latest model. They're even more hooked to the internet now, and there's a lot more crazy stuff that goes on in middle school now than there was when I was in middle school myself, and this movie is a great reflection of that. And the main character, Kayla, played by Elsie Fisher, who is magnificent. While I didn't necessarily go through the same thing she went through, I did see a little bit of myself in her. Like Kayla, I always wanted to impress people, although I didn't necessarily have the same kinds of social anxieties that she had. But the way in which Elsie Fisher portrays all of this is one of the most realistic portrayals of a teenager I think I've ever seen in a movie. This feels very much like what most of today's teenagers probably are, and not just a Hollywoodized version of a teenager. And as a result, I think 8th grade is one of the best coming-of-age movies I've seen this whole decade. And it's not just Elsie Fisher, too. The rest of the cast is great, especially Josh Hamilton as Kayla's father, and he's a single dad in this movie. And in most movies, single dads are usually the butt of a joke. They're often portrayed as buffoons or clowns who are basically just big kids themselves. But here, you know, he feels like a real father. He's very serious about being a father. He wants the best for his daughter. He wants to protect her. And near the end of the film, there's a very heartwarming conversation between the two of them, which, if you're not moved by that conversation, then I don't know what would move you, because it's one of the most moving things I've seen in a movie this past year. And as I said before, Bo Burnham, even though this is his directorial debut, it feels like he's a true professional, because his writing is fantastic, his directing is fantastic, and he clearly remembers what his own middle school years were like, because if he had been a lot older, then I think this movie would have felt like a much more Hollywoodized version than the more realistic version it is. And Bo Burnham actually is the same age as me. I actually looked up his birth date. I'm actually a few months older than he is. This movie is definitely a coming-of-age movie I think is going to be discussed for a long time, and I wouldn't be surprised in the future if it's ranked up there with movies like Stand By Me as some of the best coming-of-age movies of all time. And I think it deserves to be up there, because the best coming-of-age movies are always the ones that feel the most realistic and authentic, you know, no matter when it's made or who it's about. And this, I think, is definitely up there with the best of them. Number 8, The Hate U Give. Now, most movies based on young adult novels are usually not very good, and often the books they're based on probably aren't that very good either. A lot of them probably contain a lot of sappy moments, cliche storylines, stereotypical characters, and just very predictable plot from beginning to end. But The Hate U Give is not one of those stories at all. It deals with a lot of things that most young adult novels would probably never dare to tackle, like police brutality, racism, Black Lives Matter. So this movie tells the story of a black girl named Star, played by Amanda Stenberg, whom you may remember as Rue from The Hunger Games, and when her friend Khalil is murdered by a white police officer after they're pulled over when coming home from a party, she ends up being put in a dilemma of whether or not she should go before a grand jury to identify him because the local drug dealer is threatening violence against her family if she does go forward, but she still wants justice done, and at the same time, she's having to struggle with balancing her home life in a black neighborhood and her school life at a mostly white prep school. So this film, needless to say, tackles a lot of stuff in 2 hours. And when you tackle a lot of subjects in a movie, especially ones as serious as these, it's a very tricky thing to do. But here it's portrayed quite excellently. The movie really gives you the sense of racial injustice that a lot of African Americans have and continue to face to this day. It really tackles the ignorance that a lot of white people have about these kinds of issues and how they often tend to just shrug it off or not care because they know it'll probably never happen to them. But it also presents the idea that these problems can be taken on and that change can happen, but it has to come from everyone. And in addition to Amanda Stenberg, the rest of the cast is also fantastic. Russell Hornsby is amazing and Oscar-worthy for a Best Supporting Actor nomination as Star's father. Regina Hall is great as the mother. Algie Smith is good as Khalil. Anthony Mackie is also good as the neighborhood drug dealer who threatens violence against Star. There's not a single bad performance in the whole cast. George Tillman Jr.'s directing is great, and also I got to give a big mention to the writing. The writing of this movie is fantastic. It's one of the best written young adult movies I've ever seen, and my deepest condolences to the family of Audrey Wells, the film's screenwriter, because she sadly passed away the day before this movie was released into theaters. But she did a magnificent job, and her family especially should be very proud. So rest in peace, Audrey Wells. You wrote a fantastic movie. And this movie is, like some others, flown under the radar because I think a lot of people are probably uncomfortable seeing a movie dealing with these kinds of things. But this is a movie I think everyone should see at least once in their life, if only for you to see how prevalent these issues still are. Number 7, Won't You Be My Neighbor? This documentary had a lot of hype before I went in to see it, and did it live up to the hype? Yes, it absolutely did. Whenever I see a documentary in the theater, there often isn't a huge crowd, but I saw this with a sold-out crowd. I mean, this theater was packed. And when the movie was over, the entire theater, including myself, was crying. And it's not just me. I've heard at many theaters this exact same thing happened. And let me tell you, the tears are well-deserved, because this is a beautiful, beautiful portrait of Fred Rogers, or as we all know him, Mr. Rogers. And of course it details the history of his show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and that he created it because he was appalled by the cartoon violence and blatant advertising that was prevalent on television back then, aimed at kids. And he wanted to change that and make a show for kids that not only addressed their fears and took their concerns seriously, because most adults will just shrug off children's fears as nonsense, but show children that it's important to know what goes on in the world and that they can learn about difficult things if it's handled in a sensitive, age-appropriate manner. And and it shows how he dealt with these things by talking about things that people think children shouldn't have to talk about, things but are important for them anyway, like death, divorce, war, violence, things we don't want to expose children to, but they still need to know about, because the world isn't always a nice place, and if we try to shelter children too much, they won't know how to deal with these kinds of things. But of course, this documentary is not just about the TV show, it's about Mr. Rogers as a person. We learn a lot of things about him that we never would have known unless we were a member of his family. We learn a lot about his childhood and how his insecurities from his childhood, such as being bullied for being overweight, carried into his adulthood and affected his themes, and how that became the focus of some of his most famous characters, like Daniel Striped Tiger. We see his life with his family and his friends, and we see that he truly was the same person off camera he was on camera, because, you know, so many people are often exposed for being hypocrites and for being different from who they say they are, and of course we experience massive disappointment and anger when that happens. But Mr. Rogers truly was who he said he was, and that's why he's still so beloved, even though he's been dead since 2003. And this film shows that we really need more Mr. Rogerses in this world, that we need people to preach kindness and empathy and tolerance and understanding, and that we need to include both adults and children in trying to resolve problems, because children are going to grow up and become adults, and one day they're going to have to deal with all these, and then whatever problems arise will have to be passed on to the next generation afterwards. And it's important that everyone know how to handle these types of things and be a good person, so that way we can build the kind of world Mr. Rogers wanted to build. And that's what this documentary is calling for. And what really hit me in the heart at the end was when all the people being interviewed were asked to think about the one person that made an impact on them throughout their life, which was what Mr. Rogers often asked people to do. And I could sense that the entire theater was doing that as well, and I know I was. So yeah, if you've not yet seen this documentary, what are you waiting for? Go watch it. Even if you're not a big documentary person, this is one of those documentaries that you should check out at some time in your life. And even if you weren't a big Mr. Rogers fan, you should at least check this out just so you can get a better understanding of who he was. Because Mr. Rogers, almost everyone has grown up with him during their life, or at least known who he is, and I think it's important. And this film showcases that his legacy needs to be kept alive, and I hope it is. Number 6, A Quiet Place. I don't usually consider myself a big horror movie fan, but my God, this movie was exhilarating. When I saw this in the theater, it was so quiet, I could have heard water dropping if it fell from the ceiling. That's not what actually happened, but I'm just saying, because most horror movies are often known for having bad audience members, but literally no one made a sound throughout this movie. It was dead silent. And of course, this movie is about the aliens that attack people who make a single sound, and this one family must stay quiet no matter what, but aliens are nearby, and you have the mother who's pregnant and about to give birth any day, and anything that can happen does happen, you know, without spoiling anything. I'm sure many of you watching this probably know how the movie goes, but I'm not really going to say anything else about it. All I can say is this movie is excellent across the board. I haven't seen other films John Krasinski directed, because this is not his directorial debut, but my God, his direction in this movie is fantastic. I cannot think of a single flaw in his direction at all. His performance is also great, so is Emily Blunt, and of course Emily Blunt and John Krasinski are married in real life as well. The kids in this movie are phenomenal. Millicent Simmons, who is also fantastic in Wonderstruck last year, she gives the best performance in the whole movie in my opinion. And Noah Jupe, whom you may remember from Wonder as Jacob Tremblay's friend, he's also great in this movie too. The alien design is really cool. The cinematography and editing and score are fantastic, but of course the real star of this movie is the sound. My God, the sound design in this movie is not just with the aliens, but with how the family tries to stay quiet and how they have to deal with these aliens and just everything that happens, especially in the one scene where Emily Blunt goes into labor and has to give birth without screaming in pain. My God, that is some of the best sound design I have ever heard in a movie in my life, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that. The tension in this movie is, I was so tense that I couldn't breathe until the film was over. My muscles just went tense from beginning to end, and when it was over, I was just like, whew, wow. There is literally no moment that will not leave you on edge, and that's what these types of movies should do. And often, movies that do try to leave you on edge often sacrifice the story and all the technical elements and the acting in the process. But this one does not, and we need more movies like this. And few movie-going experiences will ever be as exhilarating as this one was for me. Number 5, First Man. This is one of those films that really deserved a lot better. You know, it got the praise it deserved from critics, but I wish audiences had given it more of a chance. I know a lot of people felt it was too slow and that Ryan Gosling's performance is too robotic and that it's not as fun or thrilling as movies like Apollo 13 and Gravity. And then, of course, there's a whole controversy about the flag on the moon, and while they don't literally show them planting the flag in the ground, they do show the flag on the moon, so it is there. So that, combined with all this unnecessary complaining about the flag, really just made this movie underperform. And it's a real shame, because this movie I thought was fantastic. Do I think it's as good as Damien Chazelle's other films? Not quite, but considering the fact that he's 10 out of 10 for me with all 3 of the movies I've seen, this is still an amazing movie. Ryan Gosling to me was excellent as Neil Armstrong. Yes, he's very stoic and at times not very emotional, but the film shows why. Because, well, spoiler alert, but I guess it's not really a spoiler because any website about Neil Armstrong will say this. His daughter died of a brain tumor when she was really little, and her death profoundly affected him, and being a man in that time period, he did not talk about his emotions because back then it was considered not manly to talk about your emotions and that it made you look weak if you did. So we see him struggling to be that strong man while clearly hurting and grieving very much inside. And the moon landing for him was not just a job, but a way to honor his daughter in the process. And so we do get the whole history of him as a test pilot and all the events leading up to the moon landing, and the moon landing itself is amazing. Everything from the liftoff to the actual landing to returning to Earth, some of the most thrilling stuff I've seen all year. And, you know, it's matched up with top-notch editing, cinematography, music, especially sound. You know, space movies, if they do not have good sound, they automatically fail in my book. The rest of the cast is great too, like Corey Stoll as Buzz Aldrin. And then, of course, there's Claire Foy as Neil Armstrong's wife, Janet. And I'm glad this movie showcased her side too, because I can't imagine how hard it must have been being an astronaut's wife in the 1960s, because your husband's frequently going off into space and you have no idea if he'll return home safely, which could possibly leave you as a widowed, not only as a widowed mother raising kids on your own, and we see her basically fearing that every time, and by the time he goes to the moon, she has to say to him, no, you tell the kids goodbye this time because I can't do it anymore. And you really feel for her when she says that, because I can't imagine how painful it must have been for them to always be apart like that, because I imagine while it must have been exciting, I can seriously understand how one would be fearful of something like that, because history shows astronauts often had terrible luck before things finally got right, and the moon landing was no different. And ultimately, I do think this movie succeeded in what it was trying to do, portray Neil Armstrong as a stoic and quietly heroic man who was doing what he was doing because he felt it was the right job to do and not just for the sake of being this glorious hero. He clearly believed in going to the moon, but he didn't just want to go to the moon for the sake of going to the moon. He really wanted to push the limits of human exploration because he felt that was part of his job. And I think the movie brilliantly portrays that, and if you have not yet seen First Man, please give it a watch. Number 4, A Star is Born. Like many people, I was very hesitant about this movie. This movie had already been made 3 times, and I wasn't sure if Lady Gaga had the acting chops to pull this off because, while she has acted before, a lot of her previous roles have relied on her Lady Gaga pop persona, and this one wasn't going to, and I was hesitant about could she be a serious actress in this case. And I was wondering, did this movie even have anything different to offer than the other versions of A Star is Born, which I ended up watching all pretty much back to back, not at the same time, but close enough to the release of this one. And the answer is, my God, yes. I was proved wrong on everything. I'll even go so far as to say this is the best version of A Star is Born ever. By a very narrow margin, it beats out Judy Garland's version. Now, this film pretty much follows the same course of events as the other versions of A Star is Born. A once popular, in this case, male singer is seeing his career decline, mainly because he's an alcoholic. Then he discovers this young female up-and-comer. He helps her break into the industry. She rises, he continues to fall. They end up falling in love, but tragedy still happens. I'm not going to spoil what happens, but if you've seen other versions of A Star is Born, or if you've seen this movie, you know exactly what happens. But all I'm going to say is this movie is one of the best cases of being proven wrong about a movie going in thinking it was going to be bad, and then it's actually really good. Edge of Tomorrow is also another example of a movie I thought would be awful, but was really good. But this one is probably the best movie I thought would be bad, but is excellent. Everything in this movie is amazing. Bradley Cooper, phenomenal performance, his best performance of his whole career. And the fact that this is only his directorial debut is even more astounding because he looks like he's been directing movies for years. His singing and guitar playing in this movie are excellent, and he had to take lessons before doing this because he'd never done either, and it looks like he's a true professional while he's doing it. Lady Gaga, my God, she is phenomenal in this movie. I did not think she'd be capable of acting this good or even singing this good, but she's so amazing at both. And here she's not doing any of her previous pop star stuff. Well, in maybe one instance she is, but it's part of the movie for a good reason, and you'll see why if you haven't seen it. But for the rest of the movie, when she's singing, she has this really raw rock sound, kind of a lot like Sheryl Crow, and I love Sheryl Crow a lot, and it was just fantastic. She and Bradley Cooper have amazing chemistry, not just as singing partners, but their romantic relationship had me very invested, and which makes the tragedy that ultimately happens all the more heartbreaking. All the other supporting players like Sam Elliott, Andrew Dice Clay, and yes, I do mean the Andrew Dice Clay, and Anthony Ramos, they're all fantastic. You know, everything, all the technical elements like the editing and cinematography are great, but of course the music is what we're here for, and the music does not disappoint. It is fantastic. There's many amazing songs. There's Shallow, which is a lock to probably win at the Golden Globes and the Critics' Choice and the Oscars, and rightfully so, because that's the only song that's really been submitted for consideration. Although I personally would have liked to have seen I'll Never Love Again be the main contender, because while Shallow comes from like the big middle part of the movie, I'll Never Love Again, which is the finale song, that really emotionally affected me as Lady Gaga was singing it, especially in the context of the movie. It just sent goosebumps down my spine, and when I got home I had to listen to it again several more times because I loved that song that much. Because when I love a song so much, I have to listen to it multiple times because I just want to hear it again and again. We always see movies every year that are either critically successful but commercial bombs, or commercial successes but critical bombs, but this is the perfect example of how to do it for both ways. This movie not only is a hit with critics, but it's done amazing at the box office, and rightfully so. We need more movies like this. While I'll always love the more art house independent films that are more risky with how they tell their stories, we really, really need more mainstream films that are meant for a wide demographic to be not only critical successes but commercial successes, because it's becoming very rare these days. A lot of movies are being made just to make a profit, and as a result they often sacrifice good acting, good directing, good writing, good technical elements, but this movie does none of that. And more movies in the future, regardless of what story they're trying to tell, need to at least follow this movie's example in how to make a good movie and make a commercially successful movie without sacrificing the necessary ingredients of what a good movie is made of. Number 3, At Eternity's Gate. This is another flown under the radar type of movie, although it did score big at the Venice Film Festival, where Willem Dafoe rightfully won the Best Actor prize there. If you've heard anything about this movie, basically Willem Dafoe plays Vincent van Gogh, and it explores not just his career as a painter, but also his battle with mental illness, particularly depression. And my God, even though he technically is too old to be playing Vincent van Gogh, you know, if you're judging this movie on historical accuracy, that point aside, Willem Dafoe is amazing as Vincent van Gogh. Of course, this is not the only Vincent van Gogh movie. There's that animated movie Loving Vincent, and Kirk Douglas starred as Vincent van Gogh in a movie in the 50s called Lust for Life, which I've never seen, but I heard is amazing. But this, I think, is one of Willem Dafoe's best performances, easily. I definitely would put this in his top 10 greatest performances. He is Vincent van Gogh. And how this movie portrays him as a painter and his struggles with his mental health is both captivating and heartbreaking to watch. And while the rest of the supporting cast is good, like Oscar Isaac as Paul Gauguin, another artist, and Rupert Friend as Vincent's brother Theo, but the real star of this movie isn't necessarily the actors or even the director Julian Schnabel. It's the cinematographer. Benoit Delhomme is his name, and he's never been nominated for an Oscar. And while I don't think he'll be nominated for this, I really hope he is, because, my God, the cinematography in this movie is incredible. You know, not only are the shots of the fields and the forests and the meadows where Vincent van Gogh does his paintings just absolutely glorious to behold, but the way in which this movie showcases the cinematography to detail Vincent van Gogh's health is quite remarkable. As Vincent van Gogh's health deteriorates, as he becomes more and more depressed, the camera literally becomes blurry and resorts to shaky cam, and you might be thinking to yourself, what? But somehow it manages to work, because the blurriness in the shaky cam represent his diminishing touch with reality. It shows him moving more and more towards a realm in which he cannot tell what is real and what is not. And that combined with Willem Dafoe's performance is absolutely heartbreaking to watch. It really is. And also, this movie utilizes a lot of close-ups to really make you feel like you're either Vincent van Gogh or the person having a conversation with him. There are two scenes in particular, one with Vincent van Gogh and a doctor, another with him and a Catholic priest, and in those two scenes the camera gets this close to their faces and it literally flip-flops back and forth between the two men, and it literally makes you feel like you are the one man looking at the other as the conversation is going on. And these conversation scenes, they go into very deep things about life, death, suffering, the nature of art, all kinds of stuff, you know. Some people may find it boring, but I've found it very captivating. This isn't necessarily a biopic of Vincent van Gogh's life. It doesn't go from his childhood to his teenage years to his adult years. It just focuses on like the last, I guess, maybe 5 to 10 years of his life, which is when he did most of his paintings. But it's probably one of the most human portrayals of an artist I've ever seen, because most films about artists kind of showcase them and their work and maybe a little bit of their personal lives, but never really going into the full depth of their soul as a person and as an artist. And this one does. And it does it magnificently. I'll admit this will be a film that won't be for everyone. Some people may find it a little too pretentious. Some people may find it a little too weird. Some may yearn for a more traditional style biopic that showcases a person's whole life. But this film, I think, is very unique in how it does all of its things. And it's kind of special for me because while I'm not a big art person in terms of studying paintings, I will say I deeply admire Vincent van Gogh as a painter, and if I had to pick a favorite painter of all time, it would definitely be him. And I think this film does a magnificent job in showing him not just who he was as an artist, but who he was as a human being and how he sought to blend the two together, and he ultimately left an incredible legacy behind, even if his life was very short. Number 2, Roma. This is another film that had a lot of hype going into it. It won big at the Venice Film Festival, where it won the Golden Lion, their top prize. And I wanted to see this in theaters because it was getting a limited release, but I wasn't able to. But of course it was on Netflix as well. And even though I saw it on Netflix, I'm counting it here because it's still going to be an awards contender movie, which makes it eligible for a list like this for me. And my God, it is transcendent. This movie, you know, of course, it's shot in black and white. It's in Spanish with English subtitles. And for some people, that may be a big turnoff, but it doesn't bother me at all. This movie feels almost like a documentary because it details a lot of mundane day-to-day things in life, because it's about a housekeeper for a upper middle class Mexican family, and we see a lot of scenes of her mopping floors, washing dishes, making children's beds, and doing all that things you expect a housekeeper to do. But it doesn't just show her just as a housekeeper, it shows her as a fully fleshed out human being who has hopes and dreams and fears and goes through her own life when she's not at her job. But she really feels like a member of this family, because not only do they treat her as such, they literally include her in almost anything they do. And Alfonso Cuarón, who directed this and also edited it, shot it, wrote it, produced it, he based a lot of this on his own childhood and his own real-life housekeeper slash nanny from when he was growing up. I don't know how much of it is true and what was fictionalized, but my God, it's very compelling to watch. I'm not going to go into specific details because I want to keep the plot as spoiler-free as possible, but there's a lot of small events that happen, and when some big events do happen, they're very strong and hit you right in the heart, because it really showcases that that is what life is like. A lot of everyday mundane things and then big moments that will forever impact you. The performances are amazing. Yalitza Aparicio, who has no prior acting experience, she is magnificent in this movie. The actors playing the kids are all great, and the relationship between Cleo, the housekeeper, and the kids is very adorable. The parents and the grandma are great. And I can't remember any of these other actors, unfortunately, because there are no big-name Mexican actors in this movie. And not only is Alfonso Cuarón's directing amazing, but so is the writing and the editing. And even though this is not, these type of movies don't get a lot of attention for their sound normally, the sound design, especially in certain scenes, is outstanding. But of course, the real star is the cinematography. Yes, it may be black and white, but my God, it is absolutely beautiful. Even like shots of like within the house and in just the side streets, everything comes to life and makes you feel like you're in Mexico City in the 1970s, which is when this movie takes place. So this movie admittedly is a slow burn, and that will probably frustrate some people, but for those who like a good story and like to see just something unique and different, this movie delivers on all of that. It's a movie that from the first frame to the last frame will make you invested in Cleo as well as this family, and you'll forever remember what you've witnessed when the movie's over. It may not be the most extravagant or dramatic or thrilling movie ever made, but it's definitely one that you'll remember once you've watched it, because it takes a lot of determination and resourcefulness to get a movie like this made. And Alfonso Cuarón, when he makes a movie, he gives it his all, and this absolutely showcases that. Number 1, BlackkKlansman. This is another movie that also had a lot of hype. It premiered to a lot of great acclaim at the Cannes Film Festival and even won their runner-up prize, the Grand Prix. And my God, this is a fantastic movie. Everything about this movie is brilliant. The acting is amazing. John David Washington, who's Denzel Washington's son, he's amazing as Ron Stallworth, a black police officer who poses as a white man over the phone in order to infiltrate a local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan in Colorado in the 1970s, which is what the main focus of this movie is. Adam Driver is fantastic as Flip Zimmerman, who's Ron Stallworth's co-worker and the one who has to pose as Ron in person when he meets with the KKK. Topher Grace is also great as David Duke, the leader of the Ku Klux Klan. And I'm sure many others never thought I'd see Topher Grace in a role like this, but he's incredible, and he really showcases why David Duke is just a racist scumbag of epic proportions. Laura Harrier is great as Patrice, who's Ron's love interest. Harry Belafonte has a small but good role as a civil rights activist. There are no bad performances in this movie. Spike Lee's writing and directing, amazing, absolutely incredible, and proves that even after 30 years in the movie business, he still has true talent. This movie is 2.5 hours, but never once does it bog down and leave me feel bored. The editing is amazing, the cinematography is amazing, the music is amazing, both the instrumental score and the soundtrack of 70s songs. The 1970s really just comes to life in this movie, not just with the music, but also the costumes. But the best thing about this movie is not only the story, but also the message. Yes, this is a message movie, but it's a message movie I think everyone should see because it details a lot of important things. This movie, in many ways, is kind of like a history of the Ku Klux Klan. We see it in the Civil War, where Spike Lee shows footage from Gone with the Wind and shows the Confederate flag because that's where the Ku Klux Klan basically got started after the Confederates lost the Civil War. Then it showcases them in the early 20th century, where Spike Lee shows clips from the most racist movie ever made, The Birth of a Nation. And then he also showcases how it still impacts our culture today, when at the very end he includes footage from the Charlottesville Klan rallies in 2017. Now, some people have criticized that, saying it's too political and too tacked on and disturbs the flow of the movie. It didn't for me, because I understood exactly what Spike Lee's trying to do. And while he is sending a political message, he's also sending a social message. And I think it's the social message that people have to be the most aware of, because I think the message is, no matter who you are in life, what your race is, what your religion is, what your gender is, what your age is, what your orientation is, whatever the case may be, that it's up to us to stand up to bigotry and say, this is not okay, this is unacceptable, and it has to stop. Because if it doesn't stop, it just keeps going on, because while there are a lot of good people in this world, there are also a lot of bad people who enable and encourage these things to continue happening. And Spike Lee, he's calling for more people to be like Ron Stallworth and Flip Zimmerman. He's not saying they have to become police officers and do the exact same things they do, but they literally put their lives and careers on the line to stop the Ku Klux Klan back then. Many times they very nearly lost their lives in the process, and while people don't have to go that same way to do what they did, because it takes a lot of guts to do something like that, Spike Lee is clearly showing that this kind of behavior has always gone on and will always go on if more people don't stand up to this. Because the Ku Klux Klan, it's not gone away. Some people may think it has, but it hasn't. They're still out there, and they've done a lot of damage to this country, and this movie showcases exactly what that damage has been. And it showcases that while standing up to these types of people is a hard thing to do, it's also the right thing to do. But even with that kind of message, this is still a very entertaining movie with all the great elements that I mentioned before. And it's one of those movies that makes me feel like I was in that world watching everything happen as it unfolded before me. That's what I always look for when I try to select my best movie of each year, and that is the main reason why BlackkKlansman is my #1 best film of 2018. So that is it for this video. Let me know in the comment section below what your best films of 2018 are. Also subscribe to my channel and click the notification bell so you can get all my new videos as soon as they're uploaded. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.